Do you remember the days of COVID? It seems so long ago when we were all wearing masks, when we wouldn't gather indoors in large gatherings. It was only, it started 6 years ago. 5 years ago, I started here at All Saints, right in the heart of COVID. When I came to All Saints, the church, because of a pastoral transition and because of COVID, the church had not been able to physically be together in 6 months since the fall, the last time when they could be outside together. And so when I started here at All Saints, the first order of business in my mind is think, how can we get back together as a community? And the idea was, wow, we have to get creative. So that first Ash Wednesday, I started on February 1st. Ash Wednesday came up a couple of weeks later. My friend Nancy, a part of our congregation, and I stood outside bundled up in the middle of February with our snow pants and our parka jackets, and we had ashes for people to drive through the parking lot. And back then, in those days of COVID, we didn't know how really it was transmitted, and so we had our masks on outside, but we also put on ashes using a Q-tip. And so I would put a Q-tip in the little thing of ashes and put it on someone's forehead and reach in their car window and say, from dust you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Oh, those were crazy days of trying to get creative. Well, I think about that first Palm Sunday. And again, thinking we need to get together as community. And so we set a goal here, leadership and I partnered to set a goal that we would worship together outside on Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday that year was March 28th. So we planned to worship outside, regardless of the weather, or weather permitting, I guess, unless it was very severe, we would be out there. And so we were there on that first Palm Sunday. I remember it was in the 30 degrees, something mid-30s, and the skies were gray, but we gathered in worship. And it was a lot of work to put that worship on, as we did week after week, Sunday after Sunday, from then on until midsummer, outdoors. Every week, we would haul out plywood boards to put onto the grass to create a stable platform for the electric piano that we would haul out on wheels out the front door of the church onto the grass. And we had a big canopy, and each week we would haul a table out for our altar and a giant cross to sit up there designate our worship space. And each wafer of communion was in its own individual little restaurant-sized ketchup holder, those paper cups they hold ketchup in. That's how we served communion. And we set up chairs, and we did this week after week after week. And I think back to that, and I think, man, that was a lot of work. But I am convinced, both at that time and now, we didn't do that work alone, just like we don't do our work now here alone. It was God partnering with us, leading us, guiding us, empowering us to be together as a community rooted in our faith and being led by God to really make a difference in the world. That's how God works. God works through people. The hands of God expressed through the hands of people makes a real difference in our world. And I know our worship efforts, all of those Sunday morning physical work of hauling everything outside and hauling it back in afterwards, the sound system, etc., it was worth it. There is a family here, Chris and Christine Carlson. They did not have a church home at the time when we were doing all this back in 2021. And Christine especially says she felt abandoned by church, disenchanted by church, but she and her husband liked to go for walks on Sunday morning. And they live in a neighborhood fairly close to the church, and so they would walk past the church on Sunday morning, and they would hear joyful singing. And it wasn't just one time, it was Sunday after Sunday, and they got curious, what is up with these people singing outdoors on a Sunday morning? And they got curious. And as Christine says, when they first came to worship, they felt welcome, accepted. It's been 5 years since, and they have been here. And she says they have found a renewed faith here at All Saints. They've found love. They've found friendship. It has been a life-giving experience for them. So all of that work into worshiping outside has made a concrete difference for the Carlson family. Chris is now our council president this year. Christine is one of our deeply faithful connector people who pray for others in our congregation. They are a gift to the congregation, but the congregation has been a gift to them. And God has used our efforts to accomplish this. That's how God works, in partnership with people. Since the beginning, God has worked with people to accomplish miraculous things in this world. Think about Moses parting the Red Sea. 1,500 years before the time of Christ, God led God's people out of slavery where they were enslaved in Egypt, and they needed to cross the Red Sea to escape to freedom. God did that miracle, but it was a partnership where Moses was the one who literally held up his hands and held up his staff and was able to part the sea so that the people could escape. God working through people. The same is true for our gospel story for today. The feeding of the 5,000. It is the only miracle besides the resurrection that is in all four gospels. It is an important miracle. And we tend to think of this as a miracle that Jesus did on his own. But if we look closely at today's Bible passage, we realize that Jesus did the miracle, but it was with the help of human hands. It was a partnership between Jesus and his disciples that produced this miraculous abundance of food that fed 5,000 people. So here's how the story goes. Jesus had become increasingly famous. People, large crowds by the thousands, were following him and his disciples around the region. They wanted to hear from him, to learn from him, to be healed by Jesus. And so Jesus took his disciples for a break to a deserted place to just have some time alone. But sure enough, the crowds found him and followed Jesus. And so Jesus began to teach them. By evening that day, the people were getting hungry, and they were, as I said, in a deserted place. There was no place to find food. So the disciples approached Jesus and they said, "Send the people away so that they can get themselves something to eat." And here is the first moment in the story where Jesus calls on the disciples to do something. He says, "You give them something to eat." Well, the reaction is a very natural human reaction. Is that, how in the world would we do that? In fact, it would cost over 6 months' wages for even to buy this enough food for all of these people. There were 5,000. And then Jesus puts the disciples to work again. He said, "All right, go search. Find what you have. What do we have? You go search and find it." So the disciples come back to Jesus. They say, "Well, we've got 5 loaves of bread and we have 2 fish." Jesus says, "I can work with that." And he blesses the loaves and he miraculously provides this abundant source of food that is enough to feed the 5,000. But Jesus doesn't hand out the bread and the fish himself. He gives it to the disciples. The disciples are the ones who seat the people in groups of hundreds and 50s, and the disciples are the ones to distribute the food. And so this miracle of God achieving the impossible, of God doing what seems impossible, making it happen, is a partnership between Jesus and his disciples. So it is in our lives. Miraculous things happen, just like they did in those early days of outdoor worship here at All Saints. Those things happen as a partnership between God and people. But why bother? Why does God even bother with people like us? Why did Jesus even bother with the crowds of 5,000? Why bother? Well, the answer is tucked right inside of our Bible passage for today. Jesus looked at this giant crowd of people and he had compassion. This word, original word in Greek, it implies something like a gut-twisting emotion. His guts twisted and knotted because he had compassion for the people. And then compassion, in fact, is the engine of Jesus' ministry. It is this gut-twisting emotion that Jesus feels that leads him to action to help the people. We find a compassionate Jesus who cares that people are fed, who cares that people grieve, who cares if people are ill, who has compassion on people, not just their spirits and their souls, but on the entirety of their physical lives. And in fact, God throughout Scripture is a compassionate God. This is the foundation of who God is. God who says to Moses on the mountaintop, I am slow to anger, merciful, gracious, abounding in steadfast love. We worship a compassionate God. In Jesus, we see a compassionate God. It is the foundation of who God is. But sadly, unfortunately, if we look at our public expressions of what are the loudest Christian voices, what is the message that most people hear about who God is or who Jesus is? And somehow in our public narrative or expression, or the loudest voices of Christianity have lost and distorted the true compassion of Jesus, which is the heart, in fact, of everything Jesus did. Now, let me give you an example in case you don't believe me. This is a conversation I had with a friend of mine, and it was years ago. My friend is an immigration attorney. And this was years ago, well before any of our immigration crisis right now. Years ago, and she was telling me about what fuels her for her work. And she was telling me, I just love these people. I just love them. I don't even know why. They don't deserve it. My heart is just filled with love for them. She was describing compassion. And I said to her, she doesn't go to church. I actually don't know her entire religious background, but I know she doesn't go to church now and doesn't have any other frame of reference other than what's out in the world for what Christianity really is. But I said to her, because I was struck in that moment, I said, you sound like Jesus. And in my mind, I'm thinking, your heart of compassion sounds like Jesus' heart of compassion. And to my surprise, my friend was offended to be compared to Jesus. Because everything she's heard about Jesus her whole life is anything but compassion. She's heard about a Jesus and a God of judgment, who is hate-filled, a distorted, corrupted version of Christianity that has seeped into our public narrative. And is the true nature and heart of Christ is lost in these loud voices in our culture. And it is not by accident, and the voices are getting louder. The Department of War, previously called the Department of Defense, it released a few months ago a video of the Secretary of War reciting the Lord's Prayer over a video montage with this dramatic movie-type theatrical music in the background. This montage where he was reciting the Lord's Prayer was a montage of bombings and missiles and warplanes and violence. And somehow they have linked this idea of empire and war and conquest with the Lord's Prayer. And let me tell you, that video, when I saw it, made my stomach turn. These are the voices that are proclaiming to be Christian in our world. This is called Christian nationalism, and it is a corruption and a distortion and a sickening twist of who our God actually is. In our story today, we see that Jesus did what he did because of compassion. And so those voices are loud, and we are invited to make our voices even louder. And so there is an event on Palm Sunday. Stay tuned for announcements, but I'll just put it out here now. An invitation to join in with tens of thousands of Christians on Palm Sunday to proclaim in a public way, in a worshipful way, in a very respectful way, to worship a God of compassion, to wave our palms in the true nature of who Christ was, one who cared for the sick, who healed the lonely and the lost, who cared for the poor and the vulnerable, to proclaim that our God truly is a God of compassion. Stay tuned. There's lots of announcements and invitations. We have a bus that's going down to our St. Paul Capitol to attend a giant perhaps as large as 10,000 person worship there with beautiful music. Our choir here is invited to participate. So much going on. But the idea is to take back this kind of public narrative of who Christ really is. Our God is a God of compassion. for you, for me. We are talking about a series of good news. Our sermon series is about good news. That is the good news. Our God is compassionate. And when that compassionate God works through human beings, lives are changed. The impossible becomes possible. God is a God of love for you, for me. Let that be our good news for this day. Amen.